Half a day again. Today in this particular video I am going to go over the chapter 4 key terms. French fur trading companies established very lucrative trade with the Hurons and the other Great Lakes tribes, and as mentioned in the French and Indian War video, they did a lot of assimilation with these particular Native American groups they intermarried. But coming from Europe, only Catholics were allowed by the French government to settle in New France, which limited the growth and prevented the development of self-sustaining colonies, as was practiced by the Dutch and the British farther south in North America. There's only about 70,000 French in North America by 1750. The coureurs de bois, the French runners of the woods or men of the woods, they are the natural man. They live off of what they can get from their surroundings. And they were the main conductors of the fur trade. Royal control was practiced by the French monarchy, which prevented widespread immigration, unlike the French model, which is indirect control, which was salutary neglect. And because of this, the Americans pursued their own personal and individual economic and political interests. Eventually, the mercantilist economic system will require Britain to pass different laws to benefit the mother country, such as the Navigation Acts, which required all goods imported or exported to Britain to be carried only on British-built ships. This was resisted, and because of that, King Charles II revoked the Massachusetts Charter, and he'll attempt to establish the Dominion of New England, which will then go away because of the English Civil War. The Dutch are also the focus of the Navigation Acts because they're trying to hurt their main 1600s or their 17th century rival on the seas was Holland or the Dutch. Because remember, by 1588, Spain is in decline as a naval power as a result of the Spanish Armada, the failed invasion of the British Isles. James II will eventually, I misspoke, James will attempt to establish the Dominion of New England that incorporated New York and New Jersey and Massachusetts into one huge colony. And that ends as a result of the Glorious Revolution, not the Civil War. My mistake, I'm sorry. This was a relatively bloodless coup, and Locke is going to be writing about the implications of that. Revolution is justified when natural rights are not being protected by government. And that was the rationalization of the results of the Glorious Revolution. The monarchy was not protecting liberty and property with various acts and pieces of legislation. And the Parliament then found new monarchs. Absolutism, or rule from the top down, is confirmed by the Glorious Revolution. That's a famous cartoon that's in the other video, Join or Die. It comes out of the Albany Plan of Union, that meeting in Albany, New York in 1754. It didn't work at this time. Franklin is way ahead of his time. And we've talked already about the French and Indian War. The basic implications of that is the British become the dominant North American imperial power. In the Treaty of Paris, Britain gained control of most of North America. The Cajuns were removed from the Atlantic coast. They end up eventually settling in Louisiana. And the Spanish will gain control as compensation for what they lost in other areas in the world by gaining what is the Louisiana Territory. And the colonists after this 1763 are going to be taxed to pay for the costs of the French and Indian War. Pontiac's Rebellion were a series of attacks on British forts after 1763 because they were not consulted at all in any of these findings in the Treaty of Paris. Their lands were given away without their consent. And Pontiac will attempt to rectify that, and they destroyed many settlements in western Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. A compromise, an attempt to solve these rebellions of Native Americans, was the Proclamation of 1763. Colonists must remain east of the Appalachian Mountains. It's an imaginary line, and this proclamation fails miserably. There is no stopping the hordes of immigrants that are coming into North America, basically until the 1920s, when the door is closed for unlimited immigration into the United States. Sugar Act, the Currency Act, the Quartering Act, the Stamp Act, all of these taxes and regulations are attempts by the British to control the activities of the colonists. And this is going to lead to the American Revolution. British warships began targeting the smugglers, like John Hancock. He was a huge smuggler. He made a fortune. And when the East India Company will attempt to dump their tea, he is going to be very angry about this, along with other people engaged in commerce with the Caribbean. The British justify all of these regulations by the idea of virtual representation, the idea that Parliament represents all Britons, not just the home districts, but the colonists are virtually represented as Englishmen within that legislative body. All official stamped paper needed that, and that leads to the slogan of no taxation without representation. The colonists, as Englishmen, will believe that their property is being usurped without their consulting, without their consultation. The Sons of Liberty were a radical group that ends up eventually, not just in Massachusetts, but it will emerge in every colony. And the Sons are in favor of independence. Boycotts were successful in the aftermath of the Boston Tea Party. The Virginia Resolves were announced by Patrick Henry in the House of Burgesses. Englishmen could be taxed only by their own elected representatives. The Daughters of Liberty were successful in supporting boycotts by creating their own clothing, by not purchasing British-made clothing. The Stamp Act Congress met in 1765. That Congress formulated a formal declaration, again, with all of these ideas of no taxation without representation. We need to be involved in the formation and implementation of policy. The Townshend Acts were another series of acts that came about after the Stamp Act on those various items. This is another revenue plan, not regulation. The colonists didn't have problems with taxes that were for regulation of trade, but not to make money for the British Crown. Sam Adams, considered by the Crown to be the most dangerous man in America. He was one of the first organizers of the Sons of Liberty. Paul Revere, another famous Sons of Liberty person. Loyalists were the American Tories. They continued to support the Crown. They continued to support British control of the colonies. Patriots were anti-British, and eventually they will support independence. In 1770, the Boston Massacre occurred. It was a confrontation between British soldiers and an angry mob that resulted in the death of 5 colonists, including runaway slave Crispus Attucks. There was also the Gaspee incident. Her Majesty's service vessel ran aground outside of Rhode Island. They came ashore for supplies. They confiscated supplies without paying for them. The citizenry was upset. They formed a posse. They boarded the ship. They shot the captain and they burned the ship. And that's going to lead to problems as well after the Boston Tea Party, which is another incident offshore where all that dumped East India tea. Lord North was buddies with the East India Company. He decided to send all of that excess supply to the colonies, and before it could be unloaded, they dressed up as Indians and they dumped all those chests overboard. A terrorist act. As a result of that, the Parliament then passed the Intolerable Acts to the colonists, or the Coercive Acts officially, closed the port of Boston. It imposed military government with General Hutchinson in charge. It disallowed colonial trials. You will now be tried in Britain, not by a trial or a jury of your peers. And it forced quartering of British troops. They took over colonial homes for their residents while they were stationed in North America. The First Continental Congress comes about. After the dissolving of the Virginia Assemblies, 55 delegates met in September of 1774. It was originally about more boycotts. Any of those who were opposed were tarred and feathered. Many royalists were tarred and feathered as a result of this. Patrick Henry is famous for the famous slogan that he shouted, "Give me liberty or give me death." Eventually, shots are fired that were heard round the world, eventually, ladies and gentlemen, at Concord in Lexington, Massachusetts. This begins the revolution in 1775. British military supplies, and they took heavy losses upon their retreat. Bunker Hill, formerly more closely, actually was Breed's Hill. It was another skirmish a couple of months later. It was a British victory, but they also again suffered heavy casualties. Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense attacked the aristocracy, the monarchy, and it advocates American independence. It becomes required reading for Washington's troops. The Declaration, July 4th, 1776, written by Jefferson. It's a formal document of separation, and it basically is a polemic against the abuses of King George III. There are a lot of contradictions in the American Revolution. It's a revolution against British tyranny, and many of the enunciations at the beginning of the document don't really square with slavery. And Phyllis Wheatley, an African-American poet, objected to these revolutionary principles as being an absurdity. But to white colonists, we have always governed ourselves, going back to the Mayflower Compact, and this is an important part of the American Weltanschauung, or worldview. We are no longer British subjects. And so ends Chapter 4.